Good afternoon and welcome back to Dynamics 365 Finance and Operation. And we're actually here configuring the human resource module within the F&O system. And today we're going to be talking about the project. So we've talked a little bit about the compliance and the time tab. Today we're going to talk about project. Project obviously is a separate module on its own, but the HR, functionality, the HR module actually plays a role within the project module just because our employees are the resources, right? So we need to make sure that we have an employee that exists, within the system that they can be used in the projects module. And of course, if you initiate a project, you create one, there's a lot more financials associated with it. But from an HR perspective, the most you need to do is to make sure that the employee exists. The integration, of course, is established as is behind the scenes within the ERP system. And for anybody who's actually initiating a project, they can select any of the resources that are available and that are active in the system. So the tab on top on project, you normally don't set up a project here. You would actually do it within the module under the project itself. So I wouldn't advise you to actually, go into the HR module and actually set up a project. Like project management and accounting is where you would actually set up a project. So not something that an HR would know or would do a lot of times. But from an experience perspective, I talked a little bit about the construction company that I was configuring for them. So they tend to use a lot of projects. So any industry within the construction, for instance, they tend to have a lot of projects with related to, like, creating buildings or creating roads and whatnot. So those are the kind of a project they will like to initiate. So you would need to configure the project module, and then your resources will be taken from the HR module. So we won't talk about the setup here. What we could talk a little bit about is the project control piece. Not something, of course, HR related. These are financial related, but you could, have an oversight on some of the things like the hour utilization. So if I were to click on it, if this employee has some sort of a utilization associated to the actual project itself, then you can calculate the utilization hours. So we don't have anything configured here, which is why you would see everything like blank. But utilization hours can be calculated. So the setup needs to be done in the project management accounting. So this is something that you would simply get an oversight of what is happening to this employee and where they're allocated in terms of their hours if they are assigned to a project. In terms of the transactions, for instance, you can look at the expenses that have been submitted. So that's a different story altogether. There's a lot of expenses. There are different ways of actually capturing expenses within the system. So it truly depends on the organization and how they do things. So in my previous nonprofit organization implementation, they tend to do their expenses through an AP module, for instance. So that's how we actually configured it. We were supposed to send the expense out to a journal into an electronic fund transfer, so an ETF or EFT, you could say, format, and it gets sent out to a third party who actually takes care of their expenses. So that's another totally different story to talk about. So that's one of the ways of doing it. It really depends on the requirement of how you want to configure it based on how they like it and how they've been operating, like the organization. So it's not as simple as just doing expensing or configuring the expense management module. So the expense management can play a role, but really depends on how you want to actually configure the expenses or capture the expenses in the financial module. Same thing with the fee and hour. So, these are things configured in the project management. So you could see the hourly rate, for instance, that you're charging that the employee is charging towards that project and that is being paid. So something that, we would get into once we talk about the project management, which I don't think would be anytime soon, to be honest. I would prefer to go through the HR module, and then I'll want to go into the supply chain piece, which is some more or less my expertise. And the project management is something that I've been trying to look into, but I have quite a few colleagues who actually are an expert in project management, so I wouldn't be touching that as much unless absolutely required and I want to learn it. So we'll see how that goes. So I'll close up our project piece there because there's not much you could configure. All there is to it is basically an oversight, as I've been saying. So once you configure the project management, you allocate resources, you run your financials and expenses, and all of that you can see here though. And that's all there is to it from the HR perspective. Once you go into the commerce, this is a little bit different. I haven't actually used commerce. I'm not into the e-commerce piece and whatnot. The supply chain that I tend to talk about is a lot more into manufacturing and production and whatnot. So the commerce is not something that I have used, nor I know how commerce would fit into the HR module. So there are some things that within the CRP system that truly don't make sense, to be honest, because either I haven't implemented it or I just haven't seen any organization that would use something like this. So feel free to actually give me some comment if you think that you have an idea. Maybe you had an implementation where commerce piece of the commerce tab was used within the HR module. I'm more than happy to look into it. I'd be actually interested to learn that piece as well and see where that actually fits in. So we'll go into the general actually. So general is the same thing as compliance. So you can create some new cases or view cases, buyers group. So this is actually something different, something new. Uh, so in this case, I would assume that the buyers group for this employee is related to the the AP piece. So I actually I haven't used the buyers group or dispatching within the HR module, nor have you actually used the registration ID. So it just doesn't, these things don't make sense. But warehouses do make sense to me. I have actually used the warehouses as a worker. So you would have to assign them as a warehouse worker, and then this would show up. And this warehouse worker actually has its own module under the warehouse management where they actually fulfill the the orders and receiving and shipping and whatnot. So all of that is taken care of there in terms of the production as well. So that can be utilized. So this basically gives you the option to know that if this worker is a warehouse worker or not. And then talk about expenses. So in this case, you would have to actually implement or configure the expense management module. Expense management module is a very straightforward, simple one. So just as I had actually mentioned, you know, do we really need to do or configure the expense management, or there's a different way we can do an expense, and that's only based on the requirements that we get. And in this case, like credit cards, for instance, we can put a credit card in here, but there is a full-on integration that would be required for the use of credit card to make payments to your vendors and whatnot. You can have this as a repository for this particular employee, for instance. But why would you want to store your credit cards here and then link it up to an employee? Or not? Just doesn't make sense. I haven't seen any implementation or requirement like that. Same thing with the mileage rate. So okay, this is an expense. This would make sense. Sure, this is a repository, of course. If Ahmed Bernal, for instance, had been traveling quite a bit and then expenses, and he's been putting expenses in, this you could do as a repository, so just for tracking purposes. So the expense obviously is going to get taken care of in a different out of the box solution, or not out of the box, but out of the system most likely. Uh, if the requirement dictates and can be fulfilled by an expense management, then yes, of course, might as well configure it there and then have the mileage rates right in under against the actual employee itself. And then you can track down how many times this employee has been traveling throughout the year, uh, and you can manage your expenses that way, I guess. uh, Employee mapping and per diem rates. So if you don't know what per diem rates are, basically uh, if you're traveling, and I tend to travel quite a bit for these implementations as a functional consultant, so we are given a per diem rate, which means that in the morning, like if I wanted to have breakfast, I want to expense it, I'm given like $20 for a breakfast. So that's a per diem rate. So regardless if I use $20 or less, once I expense it, I will be paid $20 for the breakfast. and same thing goes for the lunch and the dinner. And then there are organizations that have per diem rate based on the amount of you travel. So you would really have to manage your expenses that way. And you can't be traveling too little or too much, for instance. Otherwise, if you're traveling too much, you're above the per diem rate, then whatever the difference is, you end up paying for it. And that's where the per diem rates come in. So with that, actually, we'll close our conversation and we'll move on to the next subject within the HR module.